A good night of Shabbos. As we are celebrating the 53rd anniversary of Yom Yerushalayim, which is like the culmination of the Six-Day War, I would like to share some personal recollections of the Six-Day War and the Rebbe's inspiration. Now, we personally, my wife and myself, we got married in 1967 in Melbourne, before Purim. The Rebbe instructed us to continue our rabbinic studies, our post-rabbinic studies in Israel, after which he instructed us to come to Australia. So after Purim, before Pesach, in 1967, we traveled to Israel. Subsequent to that, there was in Israel at the time a very great worry. What was happening was that the tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors were very, very serious. And there was discussion and talk of war. And Israel was celebrating its Independence Day, which was in the beginning of Iyar, just 2 weeks after Pesach. The Israeli government received word that the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was moving heavy artillery into the Sinai Desert, and additionally, large numbers of Egyptian forces were crossing the Suez Canal into the Sinai Desert. The Egyptian government had put its army on alert for an upcoming war. Syria and Jordan also moved into a state of alert and announced they would not sit by idly if Israel attacked Egypt. On the next day, the Egyptians instructed the United Nations, this is May the 16th, that the United Nations Emergency Force, whose stated role was to serve as a buffer between Israel and Egypt, to leave the Sinai Desert. They complied with this directive. A week later, Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli vessels and any ships that transported military equipment to Israel. Israel considered this move an act of war. The sentiments in Israel at the time were extremely, extremely serious and glum, to such an extent that what happened was that subsequently we found out, it became public knowledge, that the Egyptians had plans to bomb strategic targets in Israel and dispatch their tanks across the Negev to Jordan in order to cut Israel in half. This plan was nicknamed the Dawn. This was the brainchild of Army Chief Abdul Amar. Nasser did really not want to be blamed for an attack against Israel, but he was not confident that he had the power to tell Amar not to launch this operation that was called Operation Dawn. Originally, this raid, this attack, was planned for May the 27th. Why did this operation not take place? No, we are told that Leiv Melochim V'Sorim Biyad Hashem, the heart of kings and princes is in the hands of Hashem. And the President of the United States at that stage, Lyndon Johnson, suddenly had a gut feeling that Egypt was going to attack Israel. He therefore called in the Egyptian ambassador and instructed him and warned him against Egypt attacking Israel. At the same time, Moscow wasn't interested in there being a war and also instructed Egypt not to attack Israel. The last moment, just moments before the General Amar was due to launch the operation, Nasser ordered him to desist. Had the operation been carried out, the results would likely have been as devastating to Israel as Israel's attack on Egypt 9 days later. The sentiments in Israel were such that the feelings were that it was a time of total and complete desperation. The foreign embassies called for their citizens to immediately evacuate from Israel. Foreign airlines were starting to cut their services to Israel. The Israeli daily, Yedias Achronos, however, at that particular stage, carried a surprisingly uplifting headline. God is watching over the Holy Land and salvation is near. Where did this come from? This came from the Rebbe's message. At that stage, there was this public statement by the Rebbe. Thousands of miles away in Brooklyn, more than 20,000 children and adults gathered on the streets to celebrate the day of Lag BaOmer. And in his address to the children and to the gathering, the Rebbe spoke forcefully about the situation in Israel. The Rebbe declared, God is guarding them and sending them his blessings and salvation in extraordinary measure. The people of Israel will emerge from the current situation with remarkable success. The Rebbe urged the children to do good deeds to the merit of their brethren in Israel, and then, in a strong voice, expressing unmistakable confidence and assurance, he proceeded to quote God's blessing and assurance. I will bring peace to the land, and you will lie down with no one to frighten you. He concluded, God will extract the Jewish nation from all hardships with his full, open, holy, and outstretched hand, and will bring them peace and tranquility. So newspapers across Israel, from Haaretz to Al HaMishmar, from all points of the political spectrum, carried uplifting headlines in the Rebbe's name. The Rebbe's reassuring talk at the Lag BaOmer parade reached the studios of Israel's national radio, Kol Yisrael, and was broadcast with simultaneous translation from the original Yiddish to Hebrew. The media also made note of the fact that the Rebbe urged all foreigners who were in Israel to remain there. Now, in actual fact, at that stage, the rabbis who were approached by the foreign students, the students that came from all over the world to study in Israel, and the students asked the rabbis whether they are permitted to leave until such time that the problems will blow over. And none of the rabbis had the strength of conviction to tell them to stay. And many rabbis themselves left. The only Jewish leader who stood up and maintained strongly that people have to stay in Israel was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And indeed, we ourselves, myself being from the United States, my wife being from Australia, we asked the Rebbe whether we should leave Israel until the danger is over. And the Rebbe sent us a telegram. And the words of the telegram that we still have was, Yamshichu lilmoid b'shkido v'asmodo bevadai ubevadai lo yonam v'lo yishon shomer Yisrael. You should continue to study diligently, and certainly the God of Israel does not slumber and does not sleep. V'vasru toiv, and they and you will notify good news. This was the message that the Rebbe gave to every single individual who asked him whether they should be able to leave Israel. At that stage, there were many, many young people in Israel, and people who went to Israel under the Rebbe's guidance, but whose parents were not necessarily Chassidim, and they were very unhappy because the newspapers, the media, was extremely gloomy, and they foretold total disaster. The words, a second Holocaust, was something that was being spoken about openly. And people came to the Rebbe, and I became aware of that subsequent to that. People came to the Rebbe and knocked on his door and shouted at the Rebbe, why are you not allowing our children to come back? You had a couple who were Holocaust survivors and who lost their whole family in the Holocaust. And they came to the Rebbe and they begged him, Rebbe, please allow our son to come back to America. Our son is an only child. The Rebbe said, all of my students there are only children. And I promise you that Hashem will look after the Jewish people, and there will be a major victory. Now, how the Rebbe knew of this victory, how the Rebbe was able to prophesize this, was something that absolutely it was impossible for simple mortals like us to understand. But indeed, this particular experience of the Rebbe's vision, the Rebbe's prophecy, was something that gave strength to everybody in Israel prior to the war itself. And from my particular perspective and from our particular perspective, this reminded me of this that the Torah tells us. Before God gave the Jewish people the Torah, he reminded them as to all of the miracles that they experience. Atem re'isem es asher osisi leMitzrayim. You, Jewish people, you have seen what I have done in Egypt. You have seen the miracles that I made and how I looked after you. Even though things looked sometimes so difficult and they looked impossible, the challenges seemed to be insurmountable, but you see how I extricated you from it in the most positive and public manner. And therefore you see that whatever I tell you is only as a result of my love to you, and you should accept the Torah, which they did by saying we will accept and we will listen. We will do and we will listen. And when the Jewish people saw that experience, when they saw the miracles that gave them the motivation, that gave them the understanding, that gave them the strength to be able to focus, to come to terms with whatever other difficulties and vicissitudes they needed to go through. And this is how it was with us, seeing the miracles of the Six-Day War and the prophecy of the Rebbe relating to that was something that was a very momentous occasion and experience in our own lives that really gave us a direction for the rest of our lives and for our mission that we continued here in Sydney. And then one day followed the other day. When the war broke out, the Rebbe gave instructions that we should see to it to put on tefillin on all the soldiers. We should put on tefillin, have a tefillin campaign. And he said that the tefillin is in itself a segula, a method by which the fear will fall upon the foreign soldiers who will be attacking the Jewish soldiers. And he quoted a Rosh, he quoted one of the commentaries on, and a verse in the Torah that speaks about the strength of the tribe of Gad, who was so strong that they were able in one swipe to chop off a head and an arm. And he associated this with the tefillin on the head and the tefillin on the arm, where it says, the nations of the world will see that the name of God is upon you and they will fear you. And this was something that we were therefore encouraged to put tefillin on to whoever we are able to. On the first day of the war, when I studied at that time in Kfar Chabad, I lived in Kfar Chabad, but I studied in Lud, which is another city that on the train, that is the next station from Kfar Chabad, and 6 o'clock in the morning was when we started our studies in Lud, and we traveled on the train, and this train was going to Be'er Sheva, traveling to the south, and all the reservists were being called. And so we went around putting on tefillin, and everybody said, of course, we know about this. It's become public. All of us have put on tefillin. Who is not going to put on tefillin? With the Rebbe's encouragement and the Rebbe's support and the Rebbe's vision. Indeed, President Shazar was in touch with the Rebbe, and President Shazar repeated that the Rebbe guaranteed him that there is going to be a major victory. And so, the first day of the war went by, the second day of the war went by, and what is it that we hear? We open the radio, we listen to the radio, and on the Israeli sites, the radio is just playing music and giving absolutely no information. The Arabs had a station I mentioned last week. The Arabs made a Hebrew speaking station, and on that station they kept on giving reports. Now we have attacked, our Air Force have attacked Tel Aviv. Now our Air Force have attacked Haifa. Now the garrison in Beersheba is destroyed. The Israeli Air Force is being destroyed. Every single time they came up with another terrible information about what was going on in the war. It seems that they were actually trying to talk themselves into it. It was like the Iraqi information minister was speaking about when the American troops were outside the compound. He was speaking about how Iraq has chased away all the American forces. This was an idiocy, but we had no way of knowing what the truth was. But from my particular perspective, I had absolutely no question whatsoever in my mind that what they are saying is absolutely false, and that Hashem is providing the victory to our soldiers. And that's the experience, that was the emotions that we went through. And I actually personally was so convinced that what the Rebbe said was going to take place, that when the air raid sirens were going, I refused to go into the air raid shelters, because I said, the Rebbe said that everything is going to be a wonderful success, and certainly nothing is going to happen. The people in the village itself were so encouraged by the fact that we had the opportunity to leave, and nonetheless we didn't leave because the Rebbe instructed us not to. And the fact that all of us, all of the Chabad students and Chabad rabbis remained in Israel was a major morale booster for all of the people that were there, and of course for the soldiers that were fighting. First day went by, the second day went by, and then we reached a stage. I'm not going to go into the details because this would take a very long time, but I'm only going to go into what happened in the second day. Was something that we actually saw the fulfillment of the verses in the Torah that says, I am going to put the fear of God into the hearts of those soldiers that are going against you. And this is what happened on the second day of the war, where on the first day of the war, the Israeli ground forces overran the strategic road junction to gain access to the central route. What happened? As a result of that, the Egyptian forces just turned around and ran away. Now we find in Melachim, in Kings, we find how Hashem assisted the people of Israel on the battlefield and encouraging and frightening the other people, to have the other soldiers to run away. It says in the verse in Chumash, I will send my terror before you, will throw into confusion all the people against whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their back unto you. By the second day of the 6-day war, the Egyptian army had fallen into that same kind of confusion. Egyptian commanders contradicted common sense, calling for unnecessary retreats and withdrawals. And I mentioned last week about the fact that this major battle where the Israeli soldiers came into this fortress and they found that the whole thing was already totally and completely abandoned. And the Egyptians, thousands of soldiers, together with all of their armor were left in the desert. They left, this was a reminiscence of what was written in Melachim and Kings. All the way was full of clothes and equipment which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. We find this verse in Kings. This is exactly what happened to the Egyptian army. When the Egyptian Minister of Defense, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amir, heard about the defeat at Abu Ajila, he inexplicably ordered all his units in the Sinai to retreat to the west bank of the Suez Canal. Israeli ground forces troops advanced in the Sinai, found all Egyptian positions abandoned with tanks and heavy armor left in perfect condition. They acquired so much abandoned Egyptian armor that after the war they had enough to outfit 5 new brigades. Now the other thing, this is what we are talking about, this mass desertion in the desert, reminiscent of what is written in the Torah and in Melachim, in the Kings. And the only other thing I'm going to mention about these unbelievable, amazing miracles that were experienced. One of the things that we experienced was that after the war, in the media, there was one tale after another. Here we had a tank commander who said that they lost their way and they were surrounded by Egyptian tanks. They turned and prayed to Hashem. Hashem, you have in the desert previously shown us the way with a pillar of fire to show us the way to salvation. Please help us. Suddenly, they found a ridgeway off the side that was able to enable them to escape from the other tanks. There were stories from airplane pilots, from the war pilots, from tank commanders, from sergeants, from units, again and again and again, how miraculously they were able to be successful. The only other thing that I want to be able to mention is Yerushalayim. And today we are celebrating Yom Yerushalayim. Now, how did it come about that Yerushalayim was attacked? How did it come about that Yerushalayim was conquered and Yerushalayim was captured? So, this was really quite astonishing. In the first instance, Israel did not want to open another front along its eastern border with Jordan. And they begged Jordan not to enter the war. And Jordan, nonetheless, was attacking with their snipers in Jerusalem, etc., etc. However, King Hussein, as such, really had no interest in a war with Israel, but he couldn't back out of helping Egypt for fear of losing his throne and losing his life. So he absolved himself of any response by putting his army under the Egyptian command. On June the 5th, Israel sent a message to Hussein, urging him not to open fire. Despite shelling that the Jordanians were shelling into western Jerusalem, Netanya and the outskirts of Tel Aviv, Israel did nothing to respond. Afraid that Jordan would launch a siege of western Jerusalem along the lines of the 1948 siege, Israel reacted by sending troops to retake Government House and Mount Scopus. And the Israeli army also moved to silence Jordanian artillery in Jenin. With the troops at the entrance of the old city, the Israeli government deliberated for 24 hours over whether to enter. A majority, led by Moshe Dayan, advised remaining outside and not to enter into the old city. The United States also advised against entering Jerusalem, fearing this would lead to the end of King Hussein and his kingdom. Eshkol, the prime minister, unable to decide, permitted to let Hussein make the decision. Through the British, he sent a telegram to Hussein proposing that Jordan will keep the old city on condition that Hussein removes the Egyptian commander. Hussein agreed to a ceasefire and enter into peace talks. Hussein himself was through the United Nations trying to organize a ceasefire. And here Prime Minister Eshkol tried to get him to agree to a ceasefire. But 2 hours passed and there was no reply. So Israeli forces were ordered to break through the Lion's Gate, winning control of the Temple Mount an hour later. That when they gained control of the Temple Mount an hour later, this was live on radio to everybody in Israel. And we were listening at the time. And the excitement amongst those soldiers who were shouting out, Harabayit biyodenu. You had here soldiers who totally had nothing to do with religion whatsoever, kibbutznikis, leftists. They all came to the hotel, to the Western Wall, and they were crying. Chief Rabbi Goren blew the shofar that one can still hear on certain sites, and the excitement was something that was phenomenal. Again, we saw how Leiv Melochim V'Sorim Biyad Hashem, the heart of kings and princesses are in the hands of Hashem. Hashem manipulated the situation where the Egyptians did not attack Israel, where Israel was able to successfully attack the Arabs. Hashem manipulated a situation where even though the army did not want to go into Yerushalayim, but Hashem manipulated it, facilitated that we should take Yerushalayim, and we should have the Harabayas, and miracles after miracles after miracles. So when we go through an experience of this nature, and we take it seriously, and we look at it seriously, we see the hand of Hashem that it is impossible to deny. The only thing is a question, and this is the question that I concluded last week. If that is the case, why don't we always see it? And why sometimes is it necessary for the obvious hand of Hashem to be obscured? That is something we will, Yirtz Hashem, speak about in the future. But meanwhile, let us celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. Let us celebrate the miracles of recapturing Yerushalayim and being able to experience the Harabayas and the Kosel, etc., etc. And may Hashem help that these miracles should continue, so that the glory of Hashem should be accepted by the whole world, where all of humanity will serve Hashem together with the coming of Mashiach.